Greetings, my name is Blaze and welcome to my channel. If you've not been here before, I talk about thoughts, theories, and my interpretation when it comes to things that I'm interested in. Today's video is actually a video request. On one of my videos I had a comment from, Pagan Coffee Talk. And Pagan Coffee Talk said, "Can you please review our podcast, Pagan Coffee Talk?" They have a YouTube channel here, and I decided to go ahead and listen to 3 of their videos, and I just have some general thoughts. So I'm not sure where they wanted me to focus the review around, so I guess I'll just start with some of the general stuff. The first thing that stood out to me that I would like to give some feedback on, especially being someone who does voiceover work, I would be a little bit more cautious with how you utilize your microphone. What I mean by that is it sounds like you're in need of a pop filter. Pop filters kind of as you speak through them. So here's an example. So here's my microphone. It's on a stand. When I was listening, it sounded like they were up on the microphone and getting breaths into the microphone. And that is very distracting. So having a pop filter helps. Also, if you slightly turn your face off to the side and don't speak directly into the microphone, you can kind of get some pretty decent quality there. I would also recommend cleaning up the audio a little bit. So that was a little bit distracting for me. So that was just my feedback as far as like a technical standpoint. It's not something that's a big deal. It's not like a reason not to do it. So the next thing I want to talk about is whether or not I would actually recommend you listen to Pagan Coffee Talk. And my answer to that is sort of twofold, yes and no. And what I mean by that is, let's talk about the yes. Why would I recommend, yeah, you should listen to it? I think it is very, very important. If you are studying or trying to study or getting into something, it is very important to hear different people's perspectives and opinions. I don't think that you should ever use one individual as your overall source for this is the way it has to be, and this person says it, therefore it must be true. And the same is true for my channel right here, what you're listening to right now. It is my opinion and take, and I would take it with a grain of salt. This is just one person's perspective, and I would apply the same thing with the Pagan Coffee Talk. It is one perspective, but it is important to get a whole bunch of different perspectives. So from that aspect, I would recommend it. I would also recommend it if you are a Wiccan or you are interested in becoming a Wiccan, because it seems to be Wiccan based. And that's actually something they say in the very beginning as well. So it's not just general paganism on a whole, it's specific to Wicca. So from that aspect alone, I think it's very important, again, to get different perspectives, and it's specifically focused in on that. And I think for what it is, it's actually really well done. Now, the other thing that sort of stood out to me besides for the audio quality, which is both a pro and a con, and it fits the podcast atmosphere. It feels very conversational. Therefore, it feels very drawn out and long-winded. So if you want to listen to this maybe as you're traveling in the car, listen to it in the background or while you're working on other stuff, I think it would work really nicely. However, just sitting down and just focusing your attention like you would typically traditionally do with a YouTube video, it doesn't really get directly to the point. It's more of a conversation. Again, that's not a criticism per se, but that is just generalized feedback. So from all of those aspects, if you're someone who is into Wicca, you are a Wiccan, or you're trying to get into Wicca, yes, I would recommend it. So who would I not recommend it for? I would not recommend it for someone who is not Wiccan or is not interested in Wicca. I honestly don't know how much you will glean from it, other than the fact that it's neat to hear about different traditions that are not necessarily directly related to what you might be practicing or researching. I also don't think it would be for someone who wants to get directly to the point. If you want to hear a casual conversation and you want to hear different aspects and opinions, great. If not, I don't think this is for you. So that's just my generalized opinion. Just because I don't want this to be a really, really short video, I do want to break down some of the things that stood out to me in the 3 videos that I checked out. So to begin with, the first one I checked out is what is a traditionalist. The things that really stood out to me in this, there's a story that he tells about cooking a roast and cutting off the ends. And it's a wonderful story, so definitely check it out. But in a nutshell, it comes down to this daughter was asking her mother. Her mother didn't know why they cut it off like that. It's what they do, and it makes it taste better. So to ask, her mom, and then ask her mom, and basically it goes back, and everyone in the generation's like, oh, well, it makes it taste better, and this is what you do. And it ends up being the original person who originally did it. They did it to fit it in the pan. And I think that illustrates a very beautiful story. And it's a very solid point when you think of general magic, mysticism, and different practices, that remembering and knowing that sometimes we do stuff in their traditions and we don't know why. This is both okay, but knowing the why and sharing the why can also be important and have some relevance as well. Because sometimes we can just do stuff just because it was done versus having meaning behind it. I think that paints a very interesting picture, and that could be a whole conversation in a video of itself, the lesson learned from that. So I really appreciated them sharing that particular story. Their opinions on what a traditionalist is, I felt like it was kind of vague and jumped around a little bit, but I think they illustrated the general idea of what's behind it. I probably would have gone the direction of saying, so to me, I use the word traditionalist as X, Y, and Z. In a nutshell, though, the idea of having a tradition, something that you pass down, something that you work on as a group, and people enter into this tradition because it's been laid out, so it's something you can learn from. That was kind of neat, and again, kind of neat listening to that. The solitary versus traditionalist, I liked some of the things that they covered in there as well. What is different from being part of a tradition versus doing it on your own. And I also really, really appreciate that they talk about degrees. So with my experience with studying witchcraft, with studying Wicca, and yes, they're two separate things. You can be a witch and practice witchcraft without being Wiccan, but most of the Wiccans I've ever met, spoken with online, or seen in forums, most of the Wiccans are witches as well. That's why I'm mentioning both of them. But what was mentioned in these podcasts is on par and is pretty standard for what I hear from a lot of Wiccans who are part of an actual tradition. There's only been very few interactions I've had with actual traditional Wiccans, but everything they're saying falls in line with that, and I appreciate the fact that they stress the point in their particular tradition. There is lessons, and it takes you like 10 plus years to go through all these different degrees, and it's something that you earn and you work your way up through, and it's a community, and it's a lesson plan and all of that. And a lot of people forget that. Some people pick up a book and say, I'm a Wiccan, and they just go practice. And that's fine. You can do that. I'm not telling you you can't. I'm not criticizing you for doing that. But when you have a tradition that's been passed down, I think that it can help enrich the experience. I also like the fact that they pointed out, based upon the level and degree that you're in, they might teach you lessons, but not really go into detail, because you'll learn about it later on. And they paint this picture of, well, once you get into the further degrees, you'll remember something you originally heard when you first started, and it makes more sense now because of all the extra experience and insight you have from working with it. I both like this mentality, and I also dislike this mentality. The reason I dislike it is because as an individual, especially as I'm getting older, as I've explored different stuff, this is true of martial arts as well, but when you practice or you look at practicing into these different traditions, they hold this stuff away from you because they're so sure you cannot get insight from it. So they keep it as a secret, and then eventually when you get there, they refer back to it. So they're kind of assuming your ability to understand or grasp things and treating everyone like, oh, you know nothing, and I'm going to slowly grow you into it. That irks me to a certain degree because it can be condescending for some folks, and it can be frustrating for some folks that could maybe rise through their understanding or experience quicker. But on the flip side, it builds a very strong foundation. So if you are trying to build a tradition and you're trying to train someone appropriately, this is a really good way and method of doing it. It might not be ideal, especially if you have some past experience, but it is a really solid learning method, in my opinion. Again, this is just opinion-based feedback, but I like that they point that out. They talk about sharing, but some of the mysteries are only, you're not going to learn about the mysteries unless you're going through it. They're not going to share everything. This is very true for a lot of different traditions and practices, because it goes back to what I was just talking about, that if they reveal too much up front, first and foremost, it's not going to have the context around it, so it's not going to have the power. And that's something a lot of folks don't realize. Like, I could, using martial arts as an example, I could tell you how to properly punch with your whole body. So you're generating huajing from your feet up. This is a Chinese term. It's about generating this raw explosive power. And you're actually punching with your whole body. And I could basically explain that to you. But if I slowly work on how you punch with your fist, if you're doing a vertical fist or turning it over, and how you open up and roll with your body and how you're directing it with your hips, and you have all this power and you're slowly doing it and you do it repetitiously, eventually over time, you'll learn how to apply that versus me telling you everything up front. The same thing is true. If you try to share these mysteries up front without the context, they lose something. Not to mention, too, that this is a tradition. Why do you want to just share out all the pieces of tradition? If you want to be part of that tradition, join it. And if not, go find it elsewhere, because this tradition is their version. So again, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that they're talking about that. And this is very true with any of the traditionalists that I've spoken with or interacted with. They have internal secrets and mysteries that you can have revealed to you if you go up through their degrees and training. Not to mention, too, that many individuals seem to believe that there is a bit of danger involved in practicing things you are not comfortable or familiar with, because working with primal energies. The danger level will depend on what your degree of understanding of magic and mysticism is and whether or not you buy into it. If you do, it is dangerous. If you don't, well, there's no way of convincing you it's dangerous. I'm just letting you know that folks that do work with energy and realize that working with raw primal energies have dangers involved, both for yourself and those around you, it is important to have a degreed level of system to slowly introduce you into that to be safe for yourself and others. Then they mentioned something which really threw me, and this is all personal opinion, and I'm going to tell you that straight up again. This could be a separate video in and of itself. They specifically mentioned that they follow we follow Lady Sheba's laws. I have a severe distaste for Lady Sheba. Unless they're talking about a different Lady Sheba. Lady Sheba, Jessie Wickerbell was her name. That Lady Sheba, I have a great distaste for. And there's multitude of reasons for it. I know some information I've heard about her like 22 years ago. She's back from like the early 1900s, like 1920, 1930 type of an area. I believe she was born in the 1920s, and she got initiated into witchcraft in the 1930s. But she published a book, Lady Sheba's Book of Shadows. So you're supposed to have these secrets, these mysteries, and these traditions, but she's going to publicly post her Book of Shadows, which is actually a collection of other people's traditions. And if you do any research on her, because I tried to expand upon it, I was like, I remember hearing about her, and this is reasons I didn't like. Looking a little bit about it, there are some websites that talks about her family heritage and traditions. Some of the claims that she makes doesn't match up, and a lot of that bothers me. So with her, if they do come from Lady Sheba's background, I have a particular distaste for Lady Sheba. That doesn't mean I have any issues with this group or this podcast or any traditions that have come out of Lady Sheba, but because of my exposure, I've got some opinions there that I'm not really a huge fan of her particular work myself. Again, just opinion-based. Take that for what it is. That was the first video I watched. I think it was like 33 minutes long. I definitely recommend checking it out because it's their first video on their channel. It's their intro video. I checked out part 2 as well. They continued to talk about and expand upon this conversation back and forth. They talked about how when they practice their sabbats and S-sabbats, there's different ways of pronouncing that, but basically we're talking about the wheel of the year, they are not real strict with the dates. And I like that they pointed that out, because if you look traditionally, these seasonal festivals, regardless of the tradition, doesn't matter if it's Wicca, it doesn't matter if you're talking about Druidry, it doesn't matter if you're talking about any of the folk revival traditions of Europe, these were seasonal festivals, as they seem to be written in some of the old stories, poems, and the way that they're passed down. So it was a period of time. So it's not necessarily a hard set date. We have created dates and invented time. But around seasons, the fact that they are still willing to adjust it and be considerate of folks like, hey, people work, do it on the weekend when you can gather together, it makes sense. People do even do that with the national holidays. They'll typically try to push it closer towards weekends when they can. Because again, that's when people are free and available. So I really appreciated them pointing that out. The fact that they said that they offer their classes for free, another thing a lot of folks don't see. They start teaching and they try to make this like a money gaining thing versus a sharing of wisdom and knowledge. So I appreciated that. So those were the 2 videos that I listened to. I thought they were very informative from, like I said, from a Wiccan standpoint. And it does fall into what I understand a traditionalist to be as well. And I really appreciated hearing that different take and having another person reconfirm some of the things that I've been exposed to throughout the years to kind of reconfirm some of my studies. So I was like, okay, that was kind of cool. So I enjoyed listening to those. The last one I listened to was really, really, really short, and it was It Takes a Witch to Make a Witch. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it can be its own video as well, but I have some disagreements with that theory. And the reason I have disagreements with that is because if it takes a witch to make a witch, then who made the first witch? Not to mention the fact that, in my personal opinion, and I guess this kind of comes down to what you define a witch being, in a nutshell, it almost seems like you're saying then no one else can be a witch unless you come from this original source, which we don't have an original source. A whole bunch of group of people started studying this own stuff and reviving it maybe around 100, possibly 200 years ago. So a lot of this is like new revival stuff. I have never seen any evidence or records of it being older than 100 years. And people will make claims that it is. So to me, I don't think it, to me at least, it's not a witch makes a witch. In a tradition, though, in a specific tradition, if you want to be part of that tradition, you would have to work with someone of that tradition. That I would agree with. But the general concept of a witch to make a witch bothers me. It feels too much like a pyramid scheme, such as with Reiki. And Reiki is a type of healing, and you have to be attuned by a Reiki master. Well, then who attuned the first master? Well, he attuned himself and discovered it from up in the mountains. So if he can do it, why can't other people do it? Is it more difficult? Sure. Doesn't mean it can't be done. So that doesn't sit well with me personally. So it's an opinion I personally don't agree with. I respect it as being their opinion, and that's fine. And I am not necessarily arguing it. I'm just giving my 2 cents on it. So those are the 3 videos that I reviewed. Like I said, on a whole, yes and no. I would recommend it based upon what you're interested in learning. It's definitely gives some new insight and some new things to consider. So yeah, thank you for the video request. I hope everyone listening to this found this informative and interesting. If you did like it, consider a thumb up, liking, and subscribing. And if you go over and check out their channel and listen to a couple of their videos, post your comments below. What did you think? Or even Pagan Coffee Talk, if you had a chance to hear this review, what were your thoughts on my review? I hope nothing I said was too offensive. It was not my intent. You asked for my opinion, and that's sort of my general opinion. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.